Hi everyone, welcome back to the garden. Today's to the point video is about spring care tips for Dicksonia Antartica tree ferns. I'm going to discuss frost protection, watering, feeding, a couple of tips to get some really good growth out of them this year, and then also discuss the best care methods for young plants, new trunks and potted tree ferns that you might have. So let's get started. Video conditions today are slightly less than ideal, with quite a strong wind whistling through the garden, and then there appears to be an unusual golden glow in the sky. Not quite sure what that is. But let's look at the condition of the tree ferns first. This one is probably the worst looking one that I've got. And don't worry, if yours looks like this, it's perfectly normal. Those are the old fronds from previous years. The ones from last year, as you can see, are pretty much toasted. If you've got a tree fern in an exposed or we'll say windswept location like this one here, this is perfectly normal during a cold winter. The combination of cold weather, freezes below around -3, -4, and then a strong wind is enough to completely desiccate the fronds. Whereas plants that are in a slightly more sheltered position, like these ones here, have fared better. Most of mine, in reality, are generally green with some brown patches. And the more sheltered they are, the more green they're displaying. As you might expect, the tree ferns in a more sheltered position like this one here, sheltered from both the frost and indeed the strong winds, they look fantastic, which is great to see. And it really shows that all in all, this winter has been relatively mild. But before I move on to the controversial issue of whether you should chop off the fronds, a little sneak peek, no. Let's talk about some other care tips, starting with frost protection. In my garden then, I'm lucky enough to have quite a few tree ferns, and I bought most of them before the prices skyrocketed. But regardless of how much you've paid for your fern, whether it's a young one you've looked after for years, a new purchase you've treated yourself, or one that you've simply inherited by moving to a garden with one, you still need to look after them. It's well worth giving these incredible plants the winter care and spring care to get the best results out of them possible. That wind is really howling around now. Now, if you look at this tree fern trunk, all you can see in regards to protection is simply a ball of fleece in the crown. If you want to check out my video, Winter Protection for Tree Ferns, I talk about all kinds of care tips and the progressive stages of wrapping these plants to protect them from deep cold and hard frosts. But hopefully now, as we're heading well into spring, the risk of those kind of temperatures and prolonged freezes is mostly behind us. So at the minute, I've only got a ball of fleece in the crown, and that's there to protect the most vulnerable parts of the plant. That crown where the croziers, the new fronds for this year, are slowly moving up inside the trunk, that's the most tender part of the plant, and that's all I'm concerned about protecting. If you live in a milder part of the country, or you've got more time in your hands than me, then you can certainly move that fleece out of the crown, let it soak in all that rain that we've been having, which will be fantastic for these tree ferns, let it take in all that goodness. But personally here, I've never seen an issue with leaving a ball of fleece in the crown. It's quite breathable anyway, and tree fern crowns, they don't seem to mind the humidity and moisture of being protected for a long period, unlike say palms, which need good movement of airflow to keep that humidity down and prevent rot setting in. So personally, I'm going to leave that in there until temperatures get consistently mild. We don't have nights below around 4 degrees. The risk of frost isn't there for a good while, and at that point then, I'll let them take in even more of that incredible moisture, which will set them up for some massive growth this year. But what will I do going forwards? Well, simply put, during spring, the croziers are going to be moving closer and closer to the top of that trunk, and the crown will be widening up, ready for the new growth to pass out. And at that point then, when you can see the new growth at the top of your crown, which really is one of the most incredible moments for exotic gardeners across the country, seeing those new fronds there, that promise of new exotic life really is amazing. But it's at that point then when it does become important to potentially protect your plant from any frost that might happen. And all I do again is use the fleece and put a couple layers over the top. And at that point, it's not really a case of protecting the plant from dying due to deep cold. It's more a case that the fresh new growth, those new croziers, are very tender and vulnerable to getting frosted off, which obviously you don't want because it can really set the plant back and it can take a while for it to bounce back and look healthy again. So it's well worth protecting that new growth, particularly during the weeks when the croziers are visible and just starting to open up above the trunk itself. A fleece bag over the top of the plant, a couple layers of fleece or a fleece ball like this, wedge it in there, and that's pretty much all you need to do. Now, obviously, if you've got a large tree fern, there will come a point when those fronds get over a metre long, they're starting to raise up, and there's no way that you could really practically protect them using fleece unless you built a structure with bamboo canes or wood or something like that. But in reality, the chance of you actually damaging the fronds with fleece is probably higher than the frost actually getting them, because hopefully by then we'll be well into May and the risk of those fronds getting really snapped should be minimal. It really is the April period when the crown is just starting to open up. You can see those new fronds. That's when I try to protect the plant and set it up for the best start this year. But what do I do when it comes to feeding? A few of you then have asked questions in the comments about how I feed my tree ferns in spring, so we'll go over that now. And as most of mine are planted out into the ground, I'll discuss it from that point of view first, and then I'll cover tree ferns in pots and containers later in the video. So firstly, I should say that feeding tree ferns isn't a huge priority of mine. As mine are planted out in the ground, the soil here is pretty good, and the ground around most of them gets a scattering of bloodfish and bone and other slow release fertilisers you might see in my previous video. I don't worry too much about nutrition. And I think probably the main reason for that is, unlike lots of the big leaf plants, such as banana plants, cannas, and the real big leaf tropical beauties, alocasias, colocasias, those come from the more tropical areas of the world where the soil is incredibly rich, there's a huge amount of nutrients in there, and they respond very well to high nitrogen. Tree ferns, as I understand it, are generally speaking a plant that's found in more temperate regions, especially Dicksonia Antartica, often more forest, woodland environments where the soil doesn't have the same ridiculous turnover of nutrients, but it has an incredibly good structure and it's high in organic matter. So as I mentioned in my slow release feed video, the best thing you can do for plants, including tree ferns, is to improve the soil, lots of organic matter, mulches, soil conditioner, well-rotted farmyard manure, that kind of thing. That really is important, but I won't go over that again in today's video. Simply put, what I do to look after mine in spring is simply a handful of something like the Vitat 6X feed or potentially chicken manure pellets, scatter them around your tree fern and let the rain wash them in, and that is all that I do. In the past, I have given mine a liquid feed as well, splashed it all over the trunk as well as the roots around the base of the plant, and that consisted of a liquid seaweed, a dilute mixture of that, mixed with occasionally, when I really wanted to spoil them, some of the HSK specific tree fern feed. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Now, is that essential for plants in the ground? Personally, I don't think so. Is it going to give them a nice little boost in spring? Yes, it can't hurt. But one thing I absolutely would stress is dilute it down. Tree ferns aren't a plant that need high amounts of fertiliser, and they certainly don't want double strength Miracle-Gro spraying all over the trunk. You're likely to do more harm than good. So honestly, if I can say one thing for them, if you've got good soil, scatter some chicken manure pellets around them and leave it at that. That's pretty much all you need to do. And if you're looking to plant a tree fern this spring, really work on improving that soil first, get the structure right, and the easiest, quickest and simplest way of doing that is with a good mulch of organic matter. Soil conditioner, mushroom compost, well-rotted farmyard manure. That'll really make it so much easier for the tree fern to get a good strong root system developing, particularly if it's a new trunk, get those roots reaching out, which in turn will make the plant more resilient and better able to cope with extended periods of dry weather, which at the minute doesn't seem to be a problem. You can probably see some of the tree ferns behind me have still got the top parts of the trunks wrapped, but I will be taking that off soon as the chance of a real deep cold is hopefully way behind us now. Now, I mentioned feeding first in this video, not because it's the most important, but it's because it's the thing I'm most asked to talk about. But really, the absolute highest priority with tree ferns, it's about the water. Obviously, over this winter, and in fact since about July last year, rainfall has been persistently and consistently high in the UK, meaning that these plants will have soaked it all in, and I'm actually looking forward to getting some really big fronds out of them this year. Hopefully they're set up well for incredible growth. But if the spring does turn out to be quite a dry one, then I would look to water tree ferns, we'll say a couple of times a week. And what does watering a tree fern mean? Well, it means not just watering around the base of the plant or into the crown, but giving the whole plant a good spraying down. Now, obviously, it depends entirely on how the weather goes, where you are in the country, and what your soil's like. If you live somewhere with very free draining soil, sandy soil even, that's not ideal for a tree fern, and to keep it happy and healthy, or as much as you can, more water will be needed, so potentially every other day. But in reality, spring here, I'm hoping for a nice balanced spring, with moments of occasional sunny brilliance, mixed in with some beautiful seasonal rain as well, hopefully at night. But these tree ferns behind me, all I simply do is get the hose and spray the whole trunk down. I cover the whole plant in it and I make sure that the soil around it is nice and moist, and that's all you need to do. There's nothing fancy about it, give them a good spraying down. You can, if you're lucky enough to have a system, use an automatic irrigation where you've got a point that drips into the crown, but I would still occasionally spray the whole trunk down. And it's not just about getting water to the growing point of the plant, it's about watering the whole trunk, which is essentially made up of roots that need the humidity around them. That humidity really is essential because that's something that they absolutely thrive on in the natural habitats and environments. And it's something where if you want the healthiest plants with the biggest fronds possible, you need to replicate that shelter, that shade and that humidity as best you can. And if your tree ferns start to look more grey instead of brown, if the actual frond length is decreasing year on year, 9 times out of 10, I'd say, that figure probably isn't realistic, but you get the idea. The majority of the time, I would say the problem is not enough water. So really make it a priority this spring. If it hasn't rained for a couple of days, spray it down. And as we head closer towards summer and the weather can get often hotter and drier, believe it or not, make sure you really prioritize it even more still. And potentially every other day, give that plant a good soaking down if you don't have especially moisture retentive soil in your garden. I know the issue of whether you should chop a tree fern's fronds back is a bit of a controversial one, so I'll try to summarize my thoughts briefly in today's video. If you're lucky enough to have a tree fern that looks like this after winter, mostly green and healthy, then don't, whatever you do, chop the fronds off. If you chop fronds off prematurely, it can potentially restrict the size of the crown itself, having a negative impact on future years' frond length and quantity. And as well as that, while a frond's green and healthy, it's generating energy for the plant. So really think yourself lucky that you've got twice the amount of green to look at when the new fronds come out this year. Leave them as they are and let them slowly decay and go brown over time. You really have hit the jackpot. You're either growing your fern in the right place or you're very, very lucky. So enjoy it. Don't chop them off. If your tree fern has, we'll say, a mixture of brown and green fronds like these here, it's completely up to you. On some of mine here, I've actually left the old fronds on, like here, to replicate how they look in the wild. But I do appreciate that some of you are slightly tidier gardeners, and what I would say, if they are mostly brown like this, I do understand the desire to remove them. But my advice succinctly would be, wait until the new fronds have started pushing through and they're well on the way before you chop them back. And when you chop them back, make sure you leave a stalk or stem like that there and don't cut them back too close to the base, because that again can potentially restrict the size of the crown in future years. So that really is what I'd say. If you're not sure, leave them on. If you're obsessed with tidiness, then I understand chopping them back, but don't chop them back too short and only do it once the new ones have started growing through. As far as I understand, that is the best practice for these magnificent plants. When it comes then to my tree ferns here, the majority of which are well established now, a lot of them were grown in big pots at our old house before being planted out here a few years ago, so those root systems should be very extensive and wide-ranging now. And with a bit of care when it comes to frost protection, an occasional feeding every 6 weeks, couple of months, and then rigorous watering, that is all you need to do to look after these incredible plants. But often some tree ferns can take a little bit more TLC, and a little bit of effort goes a long way, especially when it comes to young plants without a trunk, new tree fern trunks you've had delivered as a bare log, and also potted and containerized tree ferns. So let me talk more about those now. Starting off then with young tree ferns first, and often you can buy tree ferns here in the UK as small potted plants which don't have a trunk yet. They're relatively cheap compared to big trunk specimens, and you get them at most garden centres and nurseries. And these plants essentially look like large ground ferns. At that stage, that plant is more vulnerable to frost and freezes than a larger trunk specimen is, and there's two main reasons for that. The first one is, unlike a large trunk, which generally sends the fronds up in one flush in spring, i.e. they all come out at the same time together and open up, a young plant is continually growing. It's continually sending out those new fronds, which means that whenever they're growing, that plant is vulnerable to frost damage, and you don't want it to be set back. And the other main reason is, because that plant doesn't have a trunk, it's a lot less tougher than a trunk specimen. Essentially everything that's above ground is soft green growth, so it's more vulnerable to getting really set back and zapped by a hard freeze. So as you've probably done during winter, if you've got a young plant, I would keep some fleece handy, and if there's a frost forecast, anything much less than a few degrees, definitely if it's below freezing, cover that plant with a few layers of fleece, weigh it down for the duration of the cold spell, and once the risk of frost is gone, take it off and let it go in its way again. Unlike some plants like the bananas, where pretty much once spring comes you can unwrap them and they'll just do the thing, frost or whatever, with those young tree ferns, I think it really is worth just keeping that fleece handy, protecting it during the spell where there might be a frost on the way, remove it afterwards, rather than just thinking spring's here, let's let them grow away, because they can still be set back by sub-zero temperatures in April and potentially even May. Hopefully not, but it's well worth doing. Next up then, we're looking at spring care for new tree fern trunks. So most larger tree ferns in the UK, other than the big ones in pots sold at garden centres, are either bought online or for specialist nurseries as literally a bare trunk or log. They usually come without fronds at the top, and they've generally been just chopped off at the base. You literally buy the log. What do you do to look after them? Well, generally speaking, if you bought them before March, we'll say out of season, I generally recommend keeping them somewhere close to your house. They're sheltered from the coldest of temperatures. Protect the crown, and ideally put them in a small pot. You can probably use one of those heavy duty pots with handles you can get off eBay, put some compost in the base just to help keep the base of the tree fern moist, and ideally start helping with a bit of root formation there. Keep the whole thing sprayed down, and that's all you need to do. If it gets ridiculously cold, bring it into your garage. But as we're now heading into hopefully real spring weather and the chance of deep cold is hopefully behind us, I would say about now is the time when you can plant that trunk directly into the ground. The risk with new tree fern trunks or logs at this time of year is that they can start shooting unseasonably early. Obviously, they're going to be a little bit jet lagged, having been brought from the other side of the world, harvested, all the fronds chopped off, so you can't blame them for wanting to make a new start and really get growing here. So I definitely recommend, as we're now heading into spring, the sun's getting stronger when it does shine like today. If you keep it in a greenhouse or polytunnel, it's going to start even earlier, and it's not the ideal conditions for that tree fern. So I think now, as we're heading into properly spring weather, hopefully, I would get that plant in the ground and I'd look after it the same as any of the others that I've talked about previously. Protect the crown, give it a good soak in, and probably the number one thing for large tree fern trunks is properly stake it in. Put a big stake in. It might need to be there for a year or so while it gets well rooted, but it really is worth doing because you don't want your prized tree fern falling over, snapping fronds, and maybe falling into some even more prized plants beyond. You definitely don't want that to happen. So I'll get it straight in the ground now as we're heading into spring. Protect the crown, give it a good soak in, stake it, jobs are good in. To round things off then, because I said this was going to be a to the point video, but I'm still here, and if you are too, then well done. But let's talk about tree ferns in pots and containers and the spring care tips I'd recommend. Here in my garden now, all of my tree ferns are currently in the ground, but at our old house, the vast majority of them were in pots and large containers. So I've learned a few things about how to keep them happy and healthy through the seasons. I think the first thing is, if you've kept your potted tree fern in the greenhouse or polytunnel, now's the time, as this sun, when it does make an appearance, is getting stronger, the days are getting longer, you need to start venting it, because otherwise the temperatures in there can start getting higher and higher and start baking that tree fern, when in reality it'd probably be happier in the milder and wetter conditions outside. So the first thing is, I would say, vent the greenhouse. Make sure you really keep on top of watering your tree fern if it's in there, and ideally I think now, look at bringing it out to somewhere sheltered. It's probably going to be happier outside with a little bit of fleece in the crown to protect it from future frost that might happen. But I really wouldn't leave it in a polytunnel greenhouse into late spring, because what will happen is it'll dry out significantly quicker, it'll need more moisture, and what will logically happen is it'll start flushing earlier, which is a problem because it'll soon be busting up against the roof of your polytunnel or greenhouse, and ultimately then it will need to be brought outside, at which point the fronds will be more advanced than the ones in your garden and more vulnerable to frost and freezes. So I essentially look at keeping these plants under glass or plastic as purely winter protection and a way to coax them into spring, at which point you can bring them outside. But if you kept your tree fern outside all winter long, I hope it's still looking good, and if the fronds have started to brown, just like the garden ones here, don't worry about it. At this point, I'd still keep it close to your house if you moved it. I'd still keep that crown protected. For tree ferns in pots and containers, when it comes to spring care, other than the frost protection, there really are two main priorities. The first one, you can probably guess, it's watering again. Plants in pots and containers need even more water than the equivalent plants in the ground, and there's two main reasons for that. Firstly, that pot will heat up significantly quicker than the soil would in the ground around the plant, so it's going to dry out a lot quicker. And secondly, that tree fern has only got a relatively small root system. Unlike popular myths, tree ferns do like to have quite an extensive root system to get plenty of consistent moisture in, so keeping it in a pot, you really need to manually water it significantly more to keep it as happy as a plant in the ground. And then when it comes to feeding, what I'd recommend is give your plant a top dressing of either new compost, soil conditioner, or again some chicken manure pellets in spring. And that way, although these plants aren't necessarily the best suited plants for pot culture long term, you can give it that little spring boost that it needs. Personally, at our old house, I always used to give them a layer about an inch or so of soil conditioner at the surface of the soil, and then I sprinkled some chicken manure pellets on. And I watered it well in, and it always seemed to set them up well for those amazing lime green fronds in spring. So there we are. That is pretty much my spring care for tree ferns. I said it was going to be a to the point video. That was a lie. But in all honesty, there isn't a lot to it really. As long as you prioritise looking after that crown while it's vulnerable to late frosts and freezes, especially keeping it well watered and then giving it a little boost of feed, that really is the most and the best you can do to set these incredible plants up for yet another year's fantastic growth. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Probably enjoyed is a bit of a strong word, but I hope you've got something from it. If there's anything I haven't addressed or you've got any further questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I will get back to each and every person as soon as I possibly can. So thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you later.